If the Vinland Saga prologue was about Thorfinn's fall from grace and showing him at his lowest, then the Farmland arc was about Thorfinn building up his identity and becoming the man his father wanted him to be by discovering the pacifistic ideology. I think people largely understand, at least in retrospect, that these were the main purposes of the first two arcs. But what is the purpose of the Baltic Sea War arc then? The Baltic Sea War is the follow-up to Thorfinn's realization that pacifism is the answer. He already understands this, so Yukimura designed the Baltic Sea War as a series of challenges that test this pacifistic ideology. Just about everything that happens in this arc is used to demonstrate how Thorfinn and his philosophy can be applied to the real world. So if the prologue was about Thorfinn falling away from pacifism and the farm arc was about him rising back to pacifism, then the Baltic Sea War arc is a demonstration of pacifism in action. Yukimura has to understand that having the main theme of your story, especially in the seinen genre, be pacifism is a very hard sell. Most people just on face value would dismiss pacifism as the solution to their problems, because it seems so unrealistic and childish. In a progressively more cynical world, the optimistic messaging is a hard sell, and to offset this immediate dismissal, Yukimura decided to demonstrate through the narrative how this ideology can work. That's the conceit of the Baltic Sea War arc. And if it can work in the far harsher world of Vinland Saga, then it should be able to work for you and me in our far more relaxed real world. Yukimura puts Thorfinn and pacifism to the test in the Baltic Sea War arc, and just about everything that happens in the arc fits this conceit. From Thorfinn having to resolve the issues with Gudrid and Sigurd, to earning Halfdan's respect, to having to take responsibility for Karli and the dog, to being confronted by Hild, to having to non-lethally deal with Garm, to being able to reject absolute power as the leader of the Jomsvikings, all of these complications are solved through Thorfinn's pacifism, and this track record is supposed to influence us, the audience, into thinking that pacifism is applicable to our reality. So in this video I want to start with the flooded turn chapters and work our way through the arc and all of these different elements to explain how each event in the Baltic Sea War was designed to test Thorfinn and his pacifistic ideology. For the sake of this video, we are going to consider the flooded turn chapters as part of the Baltic Sea War for simplicity. These chapters do a lot of things, but primarily I think their main purposes are to reunite Thorfinn with his family and introduce Sigurd and Gudrid. Now the arc is very blatantly an attack on patriarchy. The through line of the story arc is Gudrid breaking free of the restraints of her societal gender roles and resisting her oppressors as a woman. In a weird turn of events, Leif is actually portrayed as one of the main villainous figures who reinforce this system of oppression on Gudrid. It's only when Thorfinn comes to her defense that she is accepted into the group, which plays nicely as foreshadowing into their eventual relationship. Sigurd is obviously the representation of the fragile masculinity a patriarchal society creates. His character arc here is one of the highlights of the entire arc, as he learns to reject tradition and some of his more toxically masculine behaviors. He only does this by comparing himself to Thorfinn, who has become an ideal man, having rejected those more toxic and self-destructive behaviors. He has no pride and is willing to do anything, no matter the societal implications, to do whatever he perceives to be right. And he is rewarded with Gudrid's attention and affection when in this societal structure, Sigurd, the richer and more traditionally masculine man, should get the girl. But the most important part of these chapters related to the thesis of this video is that Thorfinn rejects the patriarchal structure of the world here and offers Gudrid freedom from her gender, and everything that comes with that in Middle Age Iceland. He's the one that finally offers Gudrid a spot in the crew. The action of letting Gudrid join the crew also starts his arc-long one-sided rivalry with Sigurd. Their rivalry serves as a battle between toxic masculinity and progressive pacifism that Thorfinn thematically ultimately wins, which ultimately transforms Sigurd into entirely the person that he is contemporarily, which is a far cry from the unlikable, prideful idiot he was back in the flooded turn chapters. And the narrative presents him far cooler here than here. It's almost like they're trying to tell you something. The point is, Thorfinn is changing people by leading by example, and thematically, what's being said here is that in the face of this patriarchal and toxically masculine problem, Thorfinn's ideology is not only better, but can change the status quo. But we'll get into Sigurd more as we progress. The point is, pacifism leads Thorfinn to make the correct and most beneficial decision for everyone involved, therefore the narrative and Yukimura are telling the audience that pacifism works. Thorfinn and his pacifism are also challenged in these chapters by his interactions with Halfdan. By process of the plot, Thorfinn and Halfdan are left alone to negotiate the logistics surrounding the would-be Vinland trip. Thorfinn, after all, is looking for investors in his Vinland saga, see what I did there, and Halfdan is the richest man he knows in Iceland. Halfdan is another hyper-masculine figure in Vinland saga who enslaves people and controls them through buying their land, but he almost does it nobly, and he lacks the toxically masculine prideful features his son possesses. processes. There's a scene we get here with Halfdan before he meets with Thorfinn that almost exactly highlights the folly in men's pride. There's a man who can sell his land to Halfdan and get out of the debt he owes. He would then work for Halfdan while remaining on the land and be paid a fair wage. This is undeniably a net positive for the man and his family, but he refuses to do it initially and is at the point now where he's attacking the debt collectors. He does this only for his pride because he thinks a man should get things done on his own. This interaction with Halfdan is Yukimura demonstrating that pride is a wholly worthless virtue for men to have. Halfdan in this scene brings up the example of someone who did a similar thing by refusing to sell to him in the past, and it turns out all that man's pride got him and his family was starvation. Due to the agreement the current man that owes Halfdan money agreed to, his land and services are now forfeit to Halfdan by law. But there ends up being a silver lining to this scene because after Halfdan walks out of the frame, the guards and debt collectors that captured the man explain that they were once in the same position and ensure him that things get way better after your land and services are made Halfdan's. The man still lives on the land and still has a family. All he lost that day was his pride, and the narrative is telling us here that pride is useless. But this all beautifully plays into the juxtaposition angle that Yukimura is going for with this scene and the upcoming Thorfinn and Halfdan negotiation scene. Halfdan in the meeting with Thorfinn is surprised by Thorfinn at every turn. He's surprised a young man would come asking for so much, offering nothing but a pipe dream. He's surprised with Thorfinn's fascination with freeing a bird he's keeping in his office, and most of all he's surprised with Thorfinn's absolute lack of pride. Thorfinn eventually offers his life to Halfdan, explaining that he'll forfeit his life if he fails, but Halfdan says that he has no interest in his life, and then Halfdan asks him to give up his pride as he remembers the previous encounter. But Thorfinn has no pride, and when asked to kiss Halfdan's boot as payment, he motions to do it without a second thought. Halfdan assumed Thorfinn would cling to some semblance of pride and reject this offer like every other man would, but when Thorfinn offers to do it without hesitation, Halfdan pulls away, shocked, and tries to play it all off as a joke, and the scene ends. We then pick up with Thorfinn explaining how the meeting went to everyone, and this point is reiterated upon. Bug Eyes asks Thorfinn if he would have still accepted the offer if Halfdan would have told him to eat horse shit, and Thorfinn says that he would without a second thought, because without any pride getting in the way, both kissing Halfdan's boot and eating horse shit are small prices to pay. Halfdan then responds to Thorfinn by offering him narwhal horns to sell in Greece as a test and a sign of respect. Thorfinn has to prove his worth by making a substantial amount of money selling the horns, plus he has to demonstrate that he can survive long journeys. Pacifism and Thorfinn's impressive lack of pride won him Halfdan's attention that led to the potential funding of the Vinland trip. Again, the narrative is demonstrating that pacifism wins again. With Gudrid, the Narwhal Horn, and Sigurd chasing behind them, the real Baltic Sea War arc begins, and they set sail for Greece. The next challenge for Thorfinn and his ideology is Karli, the War Orphan and his eventual son. Karli as a character is the representation in the narrative of the aftermath of war. For once, Thorfinn finds himself having to fix what war has ruined instead of being the one that ruins with war. Karli is a symbolic representation of Thorfinn taking responsibility for his previous wartime actions, and this is obviously quite the challenging conundrum. After all, what are you supposed to do when a dying mother hands you a war orphan? Initially, Thorfinn and the group have to find out a way to feed and clean the child, but after that they have to find a place to leave Karli because it seems like an impossible task to take a baby on their incredibly long and dangerous journey. Bug Eyes is again supposed to represent the average person here. He's supposed to represent the audience and how they'd react in a situation like this, if they were honest with themselves. He is strictly against taking the child with them and is actively annoyed by it. Thorfinn is then used to juxtapose against what the average man would do to prove how superior his ideology is. And would you look at that, everything works out in the end for Thorfinn and Karli, pacifism wins again, overcoming another challenge. Karli also operates in the narrative as a way for Thorfinn to go through the character growth of becoming a father without having to rush a romantic interest on Thorfinn. He becomes Karli's father before he gets with Gudrid. They do eventually adopt him and become a proper family, but he became a father beforehand in the narrative because it leads to character growth. Then Thorfinn and his ideology's next challenge comes in the form of Hild. I've been harsh on Hild individually as a character in the past, but she does work well in the narrative relating to the theme and relating to Thorfinn as a character. It's just on her own where she leaves a lot to be desired. The situation with Karli was Thorfinn's past tangentially catching up with him. It was a symbolic representation of Thorfinn dealing with the same type of destruction he once caused, but Hild is a very literal representation of Thorfinn's past catching up with him. Thorfinn and Askeladd's band hand, as it's revealed in Hild's backstory, brutally murdered Hild's family. Thorfinn personally murdered Hild's father right in front of her and practically laughed in her face afterwards. Hild has a lot of perspective justification for hating Thorfinn. Hild serves as a reminder to the audience and to Thorfinn himself just how fucked he used to be. So Hild is a challenge of what Thorfinn does when he's confronted with someone who hates him because of his past direct actions, and wouldn't you know, pacifism strikes again. Thorfinn as a person has obviously changed drastically from the first time he encountered Hild to when he does in the snow, but Hild doesn't know this. Gudrid and the rest of the group stand up for Thorfinn and try to convince her, when she announces her intent to kill him, that he has changed, but Thorfinn is frozen. He doesn't know what to do. It's a neat demonstration of how selfless Thorfinn is. He initially thinks Hild should have the right to kill him. He thinks he has no defense, but the people he has effective since changing defend him. Gudrid stands up, as I mentioned, to try and convince Hild that Thorfinn is different, but ultimately it's Einar that makes the difference in having Hild spare Thorfinn, as well as some metaphorical interference by Hild's father and her hunting master. Hild also as a character is a parallel to Thorfinn from the prologue. She's just like Thorfinn once was. She wants revenge and seemingly nothing can stop her, or save her from her quest of avenging her father. But because of Thorfinn's new outlook, she doesn't go down the same path. She agrees to let Thorfinn try and atone for his sins by founding Vinland, but makes Thorfinn agree that if he ever kills anyone again or diverges from the path of pacifism, that she has the right to kill him. Now, I've criticized this a lot in many of my other videos about Vinland Saga, claiming basically that it's blatantly obvious that eventually Hild is going to forgive Thorfinn, but her character has two functions that are beneficial to the narrative here. Firstly, Thorfinn is no longer just symbolically held to pacifistic beliefs by the theme of the story. Now, if he diverges, he's going to have literal textual consequences courtesy of Hild's bow. If he was to, in a fit of anger, kill Floki, he would not only be betraying the theme, but he'd directly lead to his demise because Hild would kill him. It's a clever little writing and tension device. Secondly, as I mentioned, she's a parallel to younger Thorfinn, a version of him that didn't fall into this revenge mindset. She hasn't killed anyone unrelated to achieve her revenge like young Thorfinn did yet. So ultimately, that's how Hild is yet another challenge, designed by Yukimura to test Thorfinn and pacifism as an ideology, and ultimately it's another win for pacifism. There's then some conflict with both Thorkel and Floki's men that does act as a challenge for Thorfinn here in the Baltic Sea War. This happens when he's put in situations where the only moral act is to surrender himself or fight non-lethally. But everything thematically said by these moments in this conflict is better portrayed by the next challenge I want to go into in detail: Garm. What happens when Thorfinn is forced to non-lethally deal with someone equal to Thorkel in fighting ability? This is the conceit around Garm as a character. How does pacifism hold up against an extremely aggressive, powerful enemy that unrealistically wants to kill you and is unable to be reasoned with? Thorfinn explores running away as an option, but Garm hunts him down no matter where he runs to just to fight him, even if it's a literal besieged fortress, because Garm is not a rational actor. Not everyone in life is a rational actor, and if pacifism is a philosophy worth applying to the real world, then it also has to account for these things. And eventually, Thorfinn realizes he has to channel everything he's learned about fighting in his journey and pour it into non-lethally defeating this terrifying opponent. In the final fight with Garm, Thorfinn both mirrors his father when he throws his blade away to confront his enemy, and mirrors Askeladd when he takes the armed opponent out using his bare hands and then a monster knockout headbutt. He channels both his father figures into one climactic showdown, and again, pacifism saves the day, because after Garm comes to and realizes he was bested, he finally leaves Thorfinn alone. Then, after the climax of the Baltic Sea War arc, Thorfinn is tested again when he is offered almost unlimited power when he is offered to lead the Jomsvikings. If he took a more canoed approach to creating a paradise, this would be a turning point and he'd capitalize on this potential massive investment, but Thorfinn stays true to himself and disbands the Jomsvikings where they stand, staying true to his pacifistic ideals. But the single biggest test Thorfinn and his pacifistic ideology face in the Baltic Sea War arc is the confrontation with Floki. Over the course of the arc, Thorfinn learns that Floki was the mastermind behind the death of his father, and immediately the question in every reader's mind becomes, what will Thorfinn do if he sees Floki? And in the emotional climax of the arc, Thorfinn is confronted by Floki and loses himself for a moment. Hild immediately reacts, and it's a great moment of tension and an awesome moment for his character. This moment shows that Thorfinn is still vulnerable. He's not completely over the death of his father, and I think that's actually evident in the post-match conversation he has with Garm after defeating him. He references Askeladd here and is surprisingly disgusted with himself for using a technique he learned from him to his advantage. He still holds some ill will towards Askeladd, and I thought that was an interesting little character detail for Thorfinn. The pain didn't fully go away, he's just trying to stay positive, and the fact that we see him slip here helps humanize a seemingly infallible character. It's personally perhaps my favorite moment from the entire arc. But Thorfinn does manage to restrain himself and opts to just not concern himself with Floki, and eventually even Floki gets a happy ending. He's saved from execution and is allowed to live out the rest of his days fishing with Balder, his grandson, in happiness. Pacifism wins again, and it even gives Floki, of all people, a happy ending. To me, this was the ultimate test for Thorfinn and pacifism in the arc, and it truly demonstrates that this philosophy has value outside of the story. But things get better because of pacifism, even after the climax of the arc. Gudrid is won over and even falls in love with the pacifistic person Thorfinn has become, and she sticks up for him constantly, especially with Hild and Thorkel, and eventually they get married, which seems to be beneficial for all parties involved. As we went over earlier, even Sigurd, the ultimate non-pacifistic, toxically masculine male, is won over by Thorfinn and the example he leads. Sigurd gets over Gudrid and his fear of his father, which ultimately earns him the respect of his father, and he finds a new love interest and sets off with his friends to make a difference in the world and follow in Thorfinn's footsteps as a contemporary. Everyone gets a happy ending at the end of the Baltic Sea War arc. It was the ultimate test for Thorfinn and his ideology, and he passed at every stage. Everyone was better off because they encountered Thorfinn in this arc. Thorfinn, for the first time, instead of leaving destruction in his wake, created a new hopeful path which shows not only massive personal improvement in himself, but says something more profound thematically, and that's the ultimate goal Yukimura has outlined for Vinland Saga. The Baltic Sea War, in my opinion, is just as good as the Farm and Prologue arcs, albeit very different, and I don't think people give it the respect it deserves. This video didn't say everything there is to say about this arc, but I hope I demonstrated why the arc isn't a drop in quality from everything else the series has to offer. This is the theme Thor's promised realized. If you enjoyed the video and want to encourage me to make more Vinland Saga content, possibly about our favourite girl Arnid, Patreon is an excellent way to influence me. If you explain that you patron specifically for Vinland Saga content, it's much more likely to get made. And at the $5 tier you get a bonus analysis video a month, and maybe one month it could be about a Vinland Saga topic, who knows. Support links in the description below. Thanks.